The Fall of Father. My name is William. I'm an old man now, but I still remember the days when my father was my hero. He was tall and strong, with a smile that warmed our small house. We lived in a quiet town near the mountains. Life was simple, but we were happy. My father worked at the local factory. Every morning he left home early and returned late. My mother cooked meals for us, and my younger sister Emma played in the garden. I helped my mother with chores. We laughed together every evening when Father told us stories. But one winter, everything changed. Father came home later than usual. His eyes looked tired and his hands shook. Mother asked him what was wrong. He said, "I'm just tired." We believed him. Days passed and Father stopped smiling. He shouted at Mother for small mistakes. He forgot to eat dinner and stayed out all night. Emma cried often. I tried to comfort her, but I didn't understand what was happening. One day, I saw Father talking to a stranger near the factory. The man gave him a small bag. Father's face turned pale, and he hid the bag in his coat. When he came home, he locked himself in his room. Mother knocked on the door, but he didn't answer. She whispered to me, "Something is wrong with your father." I felt scared. The man I loved was disappearing. Weeks later, Father lost his job. The factory owner said he came late too many times. Mother started sewing clothes to earn money. I collected firewood to sell. Emma stopped playing and sat alone in her room. One night I heard Father shouting. He broke a chair and threw things against the wall. Mother held us close, tears in her eyes. "Stay strong," she said. But I didn't know how. The next morning, Father was gone. His coat and shoes were missing. Mother searched the town but couldn't find him. Emma asked, "When will Father come back?" I had no answer. We waited for days. Then a neighbor told us he saw Father near the river. His clothes were dirty, and he walked like a shadow. I ran to the river but found nothing. The wind was cold, and the sky was gray. Winter grew colder. Snow covered the streets, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. Mother became quieter. She sewed clothes day and night, her fingers red and raw. Emma barely spoke. She stared at the window, waiting for Father to return. I felt a heavy stone in my chest. One afternoon, Mother took my hand. Her voice trembled. "We must find your father," she said. We put on our thick coats and walked through the snow. The town looked empty. Smoke rose from chimneys, but no one smiled. We asked neighbors and shopkeepers. Most shook their heads. Some whispered, "He's near the old bridge." My heart raced. The old bridge was broken and dangerous. Mother held Emma's hand tightly as we walked toward the river. The river was frozen, but under the ice, dark water flowed. We saw footprints in the snow. They led to a small crumbling shed. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled sour. Father sat on the floor, wrapped in a dirty blanket. His face was thin, his beard long and messy. He looked at us but didn't speak. Emma ran to him, crying, "Father, come home." He turned away, covering his face with his hands. Mother knelt beside him. "We miss you," she said softly. Father's shoulders shook. "I can't," he muttered. I'm not the same. I wanted to hug him, but he felt like a stranger. We brought him home that night. Mother washed his face and gave him warm soup. He ate slowly, his hands trembling. Emma sat next to him, holding his arm. "Don't leave again," she begged. Father nodded, but his eyes were empty. For a few days it seemed better. Father stayed in bed, resting. Mother smiled again, humming old songs while she sewed. Emma drew pictures of our family and stuck them on the wall. I hoped things would heal. But one evening, Father disappeared again. His bed was empty, and the window was open. Snow blew into the room. Mother collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands. "What can we do?" she cried. I ran outside, my boots sinking into the snow. The moon was bright, and the streets were silent. I called his name until my throat hurt. Finally, I found him near the factory, talking to the same stranger. The stranger laughed, handing Father a small bottle. Father drank from it greedily. I shouted, "Father, stop!" He turned, his eyes wild. "Go home, William!" he yelled. The stranger pushed me and I fell into the snow. I walked home alone, tears freezing on my cheeks. Mother hugged me when I entered. "We will not give up," she said. But I wondered, how do you save someone who doesn't want to be saved? Spring came, but warmth did not. The snow melted into muddy puddles and the trees remained bare. Father's absence became a shadow over our home. Mother stopped humming. Her eyes were always red and her hands moved slower as she sewed. Emma stopped drawing. She sat by the window, her doll forgotten in her lap. I began to follow Father secretly. Every morning I left school early and walked to the factory. I hid behind walls or barrels watching. The stranger came often. He gave Father bottles or small bags. Father's hands shook as he took them. One day, I saw Father collapse near the factory gate. His body curled on the ground, trembling. The stranger kicked him and walked away. I ran to Father, my legs shaking. His face was gray and his breath smelled bitter. "Help me," he whispered. I dragged him home, my arms aching. Mother cried when she saw him. She cleaned his face and put him to bed. "We need a doctor," she said. But we had no money. Emma held Father's hand, her tears falling on his blanket. That night, Father woke, screaming. He thrashed in bed, shouting words I didn't understand. Mother tried to calm him, but he pushed her away. A glass vase shattered on the floor. Emma hid in the corner, covering her ears. The next morning, Mother went to the town church. She begged the priest for help. He came to our house and prayed over Father. "This is a sickness of the soul," he said. He gave us bread and milk, but his words felt empty. I walked to the river alone. The ice had melted and the water rushed loudly. I threw stones into the current, screaming, "Why? Why?" But the river didn't answer. When I returned, Mother was kneeling by Father's bed, whispering, "Fight, please fight." Days turned into weeks. Father grew weaker. His skin clung to his bones and his cough echoed through the house. The stranger stopped coming. Maybe he knew Father had nothing left to give. One evening, Father called my name. His voice was faint. I sat beside him. He gripped my hand, his fingers cold. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to be your hero," I cried, my head on his chest. That night, Father's breathing slowed. Mother held one hand, Emma held the other, and I held his feet. We stayed like that until dawn. When the sun rose, Father was gone. The room felt heavy, like the air itself was mourning. The days after Father's death were quiet and heavy. The house felt too big, filled with echoes of his voice. Mother stopped sewing. She sat by the empty fireplace, staring at the ashes. Emma stopped sitting by the window. She followed me everywhere, her small hand clutching my sleeve. I didn't know how to comfort her. We buried Father under the old oak tree at the edge of town. The priest said prayers, but the words blew away with the wind. Mother placed a single flower on the grave. Her tears fell silently. Emma asked, "Will Father see us from heaven?" I said yes, though I wasn't sure. Winter returned early that year. The cold crept into our bones. Mother sold her sewing machine to buy firewood. We huddled under blankets, our breaths visible in the air. At night I heard Mother crying in the dark. I pretended not to hear. One morning a letter arrived. The factory owner wrote that Father owed money. Mother's hands shook as she read it. "We have nothing left," she whispered. I took the letter and tore it into pieces. "We will find a way," I said, but my voice lacked courage. I started working at the market, carrying boxes for shopkeepers. My hands blistered and my back ached, but I hid the pain. Emma stayed home drawing circles on the dusty floor. Mother cleaned houses for rich families. Her laughter never returned. One afternoon, I saw the stranger again. He stood near the factory smoking a cigarette. Anger burned in my chest. I ran to him shouting, "You did this! You destroyed him!" The man laughed. "Your father chose this," he said. I threw a stone, but it missed. He walked away, still laughing. That night, I dreamed of Father. He stood by the river, smiling his old smile. "Be strong, William," he said. When I woke, my pillow was wet. I wondered if dreams could be messages. Mother said, "The dead watch over us," but I didn't know if that was true. Months passed. The seasons changed, but our grief remained. Emma began to talk again, though her words were soft and hesitant. Mother planted flowers in the garden, but they wilted in the cold. I worked longer hours, trying to forget. One evening, a knock came at the door. A woman in a clean dress stood outside. She was a teacher from the next town. "I heard about your family," she said. "I can help Emma go to school." Mother's eyes lit up for the first time in years. Emma clung to me, afraid. "I don't want to leave," she cried. I knelt beside her. "This is your chance," I said. "Father would want this." She left the next morning, her small bag holding a single drawing of our family. The house felt emptier without Emma. Mother and I sat at the table, eating bread in silence. "We must keep living," Mother said. I nodded, but my heart felt like a stone. I wondered if happiness would ever return, or if Father's fall had taken it forever. Years passed like shadows. The town remained unchanged, but our lives felt smaller. Mother's hair turned white, and her hands grew frail. She spent hours staring at Father's empty chair, her lips moving in silent prayers. I worked at the market until my legs trembled, carrying sacks of grain and coal. The shopkeepers called me Old Man, though I was only 16. Emma's letters arrived like glimpses of another world. She wrote about school books, warm meals, and kind teachers. She sent drawings of bright flowers and smiling faces. I hid the letters in a wooden box, afraid their happiness would hurt Mother. At night, I traced her words with my finger, imagining her voice. "I miss you," she wrote, but I never replied. Words felt too heavy. One autumn, Mother fell ill. She coughed blood into a handkerchief, staining it like rust. I begged the town doctor for help, but he demanded coins we didn't have. I sold Father's old coat, the one he wore to the factory, to buy bitter medicine. Mother drank it without complaint. Her skin felt paper thin, her breaths shallow. Winter came early again. The wind screamed through cracks in the walls. We slept in one bed, sharing warmth. Emma's letters stopped. I wondered if she forgot us, or if her new life was too sweet to remember the cold. Mother whispered, "Is she safe?" I nodded, but fear gnawed at my heart. One morning, I found Mother unconscious on the floor. Her body was cold, her eyes closed. I screamed for help, but no one came. I carried her to bed, rubbing her hands, begging her to wake. She opened her eyes once, smiled weakly, and said, "My William." Then she was gone. The church bell rang the next day. Neighbors brought bread and pity, but their faces blurred. Emma arrived too late. She clung to Mother's lifeless hands, screaming, "Why?" I had no answers. We buried Mother beside Father, the priest's words drowned in the wind. Emma placed 2 flowers on the graves. That night the house felt like a tomb. Emma and I sat by the dead fireplace. She showed me her drawings, a family of 4, holding hands under a sun. "This is how I remember us," she said. I wanted to cry, but my tears had frozen long ago. Emma returned to school, her eyes hollow. I stayed in the empty house listening to ghosts. The walls whispered Father's laughter, Mother's hymns, Emma's giggles. I stopped working. The market faded, like a dream. One afternoon I walked to the river. The water flowed black under the ice. I thought of jumping in, letting the cold erase the pain, but then I heard Emma's voice in my head. "Don't leave me." I turned back. Years later, I still walk past the factory. The stranger is gone, but his shadow lingers. I visit the graves every Sunday, placing wilted flowers on the stones. Emma writes sometimes, but her letters are short. "I'm sorry," she says. "I'm sorry, too." Time moved like a slow river. I grew older, my hair gray, my hands rough as tree bark. The town forgot our family's pain, but I remembered. Every morning I walked to the graves, brushing snow or leaves from the stones. "I'm still here," I whispered, though I didn't know who listened. Emma returned one summer, a woman now, her eyes sharp with sorrow. She carried a suitcase and a child, a little girl with Father's smile. "This is your niece, Lara," she said. The girl hid behind Emma's skirt, peeking at me with curious eyes. My heart ached, remembering Emma as a child. We sat in the empty house, sunlight streaming through dusty windows. Lara played with an old doll Emma had left behind. "I'm sorry I stayed away," Emma said. "The past hurt too much." I nodded. Words had always been heavy between us. Emma told me about her life, a husband who died in war, a small house by the sea, Lara's laughter filling the silence. "I named her after Mother," she said. I touched Lara's hair, soft as sunlight. For a moment, the ghosts in the room felt quieter. That evening, we visited the graves. Lara placed fresh flowers on the stones. "Who are they, Grandpa?" she asked. I knelt beside her. "Your grandmother and grandfather," I said. "They loved you before you were born." Lara smiled, her innocence sharp against the old pain. Emma stayed for a week. We repaired the broken roof and painted the faded walls. Lara's laughter echoed through the halls, chasing away the shadows. At night we sat by the fire, telling stories of Father's jokes and Mother's songs. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. On her last day, Emma held my hands. "Come live with us," she pleaded. "You shouldn't be alone." I shook my head. "This is my home," I said, "but I promised to visit." Lara hugged me tightly. "Don't forget us, Grandpa," she whispered. After they left, the silence returned, but it felt softer. I planted flowers in the garden, red and yellow like Lara's drawings. The seasons turned and the blooms grew wild, covering the scars of the past. Neighbors smiled at me now, their eyes less pitying. One winter morning, a letter arrived. A photo fell out. Lara, grinning in a school uniform, holding a certificate. "She's the best in her class," Emma wrote. I pinned the photo to the wall beside Emma's old drawings. The family of 4, frozen in time, smiled back. I still visit the graves, but I talk less of pain. Instead, I tell Father and Mother about Lara's laugh, Emma's strength, and the flowers that bloom every spring. The wind carries my words, and sometimes I imagine their voices answering. On quiet nights, I sit by the river. The water flows endlessly, dark and deep, but I no longer fear its cold. The current took much from me, but it also gave me back a reason to wait. Lara's face, bright as dawn, reminds me that stories don't end. They change. We've covered a lot today. Thanks for being a great audience. See you next time.